Welcome,
Oh,
everybody, to the first session of the fall speaker series of the Center on the Future of War. Thanks so much for joining us. We're thrilled to have Joe Mouer joining us tonight. For those who are not familiar, the Center on the Future of War is a partnership between Arizona State University and New America, a DC-based think tank, and we explore the ways in which future security, a variety of future security challenges. We do that through educational programming, through research and publications, and also through various outreach events like our fall and spring speaker series and some conferences and other events that we run. We're running them all via Zoom. We have been since the start of the pandemic. And that lets us reach out to a broader population in some ways. And again, thank you for joining us. So Joe Mouer is a retired Special Forces officer who's currently a senior lecturer at Joint Special Operations University, JSOU, who is actually a partner of our center. And we've been fortunate enough to hire the president of JSOU, Ike Wilson, as one of our faculty members. Those of you who are in the online MA in global security might be familiar with his work. It's great to see this additional link between our center and ASU and JSOU. He retired from the Army after 23 years of service in 2016. And since then, he's been involved in a variety of different training operations, often out in the field, including in Ukraine. And that's going to be the subject of Joe's conversation and presentation today, entitled "For Years, We've Been Preparing Our Allies for Conflict, U.S. NATO Special Operations Training in Ukraine Since the 2014 Russian Annexation of Crimea." Very briefly, Joe's military assignments have included Ranger Instructor, work assignments in the 4th Ranger Training Battalion, the 10th Special Forces Group, the 1st Special Forces Group, Special Operations Command in Europe, obviously key to what's going on in Ukraine, as well as work with the Office of the Chairman of the Joint Staff. His operational assignments and deployments have included the Balkans, Republic of Georgia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Philippines, and North Africa. So thank you so much, Joe, for joining us tonight. We're thrilled that you're here with us. Very briefly for everybody, Joe will do a presentation with a PowerPoint. I'll disappear, and then I'll reappear in time for questions and answers. And so for that, we ask all of you who have questions to drop those questions into the question box in Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many questions as you have, and just feel free to ask whatever questions you may have. And thank you again, everybody, and the floor is yours, Joe.
okay, good. So I'm assuming everybody can hear me. Just real quick, thanks to Daniel, to Emily, and to the ASU folks for inviting me. And yeah, so I'm a former SF guy, Army, Special Forces, retired in 2016 out of the Joint Staff here in Washington, D.C., where I currently live with my family. After retiring, I joined Joint Special Operations University, which is the education arm of USSOCOM in 2018. Originally brought on to help with the counter-Russia program that was going on. I'll talk a little bit about that more here in a second. Just a little bit more background on me. I've had a long-standing interest in Russia. I took 3 years of language in Russian when I was in university. I do speak Russian, although my Russian is pretty degraded these days, just from a lack of use. Although it's getting better as I'm listening to more and more podcasts in Russian and Russian sort of analysts on the current state of play in Eastern Ukraine. While still in uniform, I was in 10th Special Forces Group, which is earmarked against Europe, longstanding ties with Europe and Eastern Europe, going back from its founding. 10th Special Forces Group out of Fort Carson, 1 Battalion forward deployed in Germany, 1st Battalion, 10th Group. I was, as Daniel said earlier, was deployed in the late 90s to the Balkans, Bosnia and Kosovo during those periods. And while in Bosnia, I was attached to a Russian airborne brigade in a little town called Bijeljina in the Republic. In 2002, I was deployed to the Republic of Georgia to ostensibly at that time to help them with their Chechen problem in the Pankizi and Kagori gorges, which is the north part of the country that borders Russia, and interfaced with a lot of Russian troops during that period, which were rather hostile to us in our mission there in Georgia, even in 2002. So again, just a really sort of a lifelong learner when it comes to all things Russian, and some professional touches in my career with working with Russian forces. Okay, so I joined JSOU in 2018, originally coming on in support of what was originally called the European Reassertions Initiative, or ERI. It's now the European Defense Initiative, EDI. It's a multi-billion-dollar, multi-year program to bolster NATO and US resolve in Eastern Europe and to sort of stiffen their spine, if you will, when it comes to threats from Russia. Since 2018, I've been traveling to most of the Eastern European countries, predominantly the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Poland, and two non-NATO countries, Ukraine and Republic of Georgia in the Black Sea region. So multiple turns in those countries to and I'll talk about here shortly what we've been doing there, and take your questions later on in this talk. But that's predominantly what I've been doing since 2018. Okay, so with that, let's go to the slideshow, and we'll just kick it off here. So Emily, if you could bring that up for me, and just go to the second slide for me. Okay, so I just want to talk this real quick because I think context is king in understanding what's happening now. And I don't want to insult your intelligence or your interest in this particular topic. I know a lot of you are probably steeped in this, but I think just to level the playing field and kind of get you where I kind of understand where I'm coming from, I just want to lay this out real quick as I look at it. There's a lot of things that occurred in the early 2000s. I won't go into them in detail. Maybe we can talk about them in Q&A. 2003, 2004, rose and orange revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine, Euromaidan in 2014. But I want to really start in 2008 with the Bucharest summit, talking about the inclusion of Ukraine and Georgia into the NATO family. That was the announcement by then President Bush that, in fact, we're bringing in, the announcement was actually for more than just Ukraine and Georgia. It also included North Macedonia, which was a little contentious with Greece at the time, but that got worked out. But the big announcement was the inclusion of Georgia and Ukraine into the NATO family. Now, immediately after this particular announcement, Vladimir Putin calls these countries and basically voices his extreme displeasure with this particular announcement. Georgia, in fact, he calls President of Georgia at that time, Saakashvili, and says, you're not joining NATO, no how, that's not going to happen. And Putin's been broadcasting this pretty consistently since 2008. His rhetoric has matched his deeds on the world stage. At least from my point of view, what he says he's going to do, he actually does. I think it's us in the West that sometimes does it. We're either not listening or are not really truly believing that the words coming out of his mouth are in fact going to happen. So April 2008, Bucharest summit is announced again, including Georgia and Ukraine into the NATO alliance. August 2008, Georgia is invaded by Russia. Their inclusion into NATO is shelved for the foreseeable future. 2009, NATO continues to grow with the inclusion of Albania and Croatia. Russia invades Ukraine in 2014. If you could just build a slide for me real quick, Emily. That Bucharest summit is super important. One more slide build for me. This is the period that I'm going to talk about in terms of what JSOU, Joint Special Operations University, has been doing. Not a whole lot of activity in post-invasion against Russia anyway, post-invasion of Georgia. Just as a quick aside on that, the Sochi Winter Olympics were awarded to Russia in 2007. They invade Georgia in 2008, and the Sochi Winter Olympic Games continue in 2014. No real sanctions, no real repercussions as a result of the 2000 invasion against Georgia. Putin learns this lesson and continues to march. I just want to put in your minds that, at least how I look at it and how my colleagues at JSOU look at it, is the campaigning, if you will, that is a series of operations, that are connected in terms of their purpose. One can think about starting in Georgia. Georgia and Ukraine are connected. How? They're connected by Russia's desire to not have them be a part of the Western Alliance. Go back, please. Oh, thanks. So if you think about it in terms of campaigning, strategic campaigning, you can think of Russia really getting serious after the Bucharest summit. Its initial baby steps along this campaign plan in Georgia. They do not do very well in Georgia. They shoot down more of their aircraft than they do of the Georgians. They learned this lesson. They tried to revamp. We can talk about this in Q&A, but essentially the continuation of this idea happens in 2014 with the invasion of Ukraine. There's a series of continuations of NATO growth with the inclusion of Montenegro and North Macedonia, as I talked about earlier in 2017, 2020. And then of course, the February 2022, what I'm calling the continuation of the Ukrainian campaign. That is the campaign that kicked off in 2014, happening in 2020 of this year, because of where we are now. And then obviously the strategic picture for Russia not looking that well after the inclusion of potential, the impending inclusion of Finland and Sweden in the NATO family on the alliance, as you can see there on the map. So that's the sort of the context of which the US is working right now. Okay, let me just do something real quick here. Okay, so I talked about the European Defense Initiative, and again, I was brought onto the JSOU team in 2018, and at that point, the European Defense Initiative had already been in place for about 3 years, starting in 2015 after the initial push into Crimea by the Russians. The original numbers in terms of funding that we're talking about were around 900 million in 2015. By 2018, it was 4.7 billion. So you can see this quick ramp up of effort by the United States to reassure our NATO partners inside the alliance and bilaterally with these countries, with the Balkan states, with Poland, Romania, et cetera, to sort of plant the flag, if you will. Emily, if you go to the next slide for me. Okay, so this is what the map looked like when I kind of joined the JSOU effort. This was a 2018 map. Like I said, $4.7 billion in FY18 for the European Defense Initiative. A lot of strategic moves by the United States, building up these battalion size battle groups, we will call them. You can see them there in the middle part of the map. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, where the US battle group is formed. I think in Estonia, it's the Germans. Latvia, I believe it's the French. Lithuania, I cannot remember who the NATO partner is, but the United States is the partnership of the nucleus of the battle group is formed by the United States and Poland. So pre-positioning all those forces back into Europe, pushing them to the east to counter or at least deter Russian aggression against NATO proper at this point. In 2018, Ukraine was centered against fighting in the east. It had essentially stabilized. Crimea was annexed by the Russians, and essentially the far eastern part of the country was considered a joint special operations area, or joint operations area by the Ukrainians. Interestingly enough, at this time in Ukraine, when you would go there, for instance, if you go to Lviv or to Kyiv, it's interesting talking to the folks in Ukraine at this point, because you would get this notion of extreme normality and sort of everydayness during this time period. Yes, there was conflict in the east, but for the most part, the country, you couldn't tell that there was a country at war if you were happened to be in Kiev, for instance. I didn't think this was stable then, and it turns out that that's the case from the recent period that we see here this year. Okay, so this is what I was brought on for. So let's look at real quick what we've been doing since 2018. Emily, if you can go to the next slide for me. Okay, so this is not an all-inclusive, and just build that out for me one more click. Okay, this is not an all-inclusive list of activities that JSOU has been doing in Ukraine, but it is, I think, a fairly good representation of what it is that, for instance, JSOU does. And this is not just in Ukraine. We've been doing these courses in our easternmost allied nations of NATO, again, the Baltic states, Poland, Romania predominantly, and in Georgia during this time period, that is the post 2014 to now period. Why have we been doing this? Essentially to prepare them for conflict. We kind of, I wouldn't say we knew war was coming, but you know, the thing that one does is we don't look at, you know, what our adversaries have to say about what their intentions are. We look at what their capabilities are, and the Russians have always been capable of conducting military operations against their neighbors. So it's a matter of providing them some real capability. That is our allied partners and our partners in Ukraine and Georgia. So I kind of broke these classes out, these educational events into strategic or national level events, operational level, and tactical level. That is the unit piece. None of these different events were taken in isolation. You can see the other actors there are NATO partners. Each one of our NATO partners have some bilateral relationships with each one of the countries I've just talked about, and have provided them with training and education as well, linked and married into what we were doing in JSOU. So these aren't like just sort of scattershot. They're cohesive. They're designed to be cohesive and to provide real capability to our partners. USSOCOM, which is the major combatant commander in the European area of operations, and their subordinate units, that is Special Operations Command Europe, that is SOCEUR, and our USSOCOM, MAR4EUR, AFEUR, and et cetera. All the European components have a play in this. And of course, other USSOCOM elements, that is Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and SOCOM's inventory have been going in there pretty steadily since 2014. The design of this thing, taken in total, is to build capability to do a couple of things, I think. Number one is to protect the force in case of an incursion or loss of sovereignty event, like we see in Ukraine, predominantly and primarily against the NATO partnerships, but obviously with a large look into Ukraine and Georgia, as a matter of fact. So protect the force, provide them the ability for maneuver, which is what we're seeing now, which I think is one of those things that I think is probably a little bit underreported or underplayed, or at least underreported in the newspapers. The desire is to allow them some ability to actually maneuver in terms of comprehensive combined arms maneuver, armor, artillery, air, and infantry working together to function as a single entity, as opposed to scattershot, which is I think where they were coming from. Okay, so national level leadership, that is generally speaking at the general officer or flag officer leadership, with Ukrainian senior leadership at the political level, that is Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Justice, and Ministry of Defense. I did a lot of work there also with the National Resistance Corps. We can talk about what that is maybe in Q&A. Operational level at the battalion and brigade level staff work. Also keep working at, I have some experience working at that level, predominantly with their planners, how to plan an operation, how to conduct an operation, and how to oversee an operation whilst it's underway. A lot of that tailored to that. And as you can see from the tactical classes we were teaching, the use of combined joint air firepower and integration, information related operations. We could talk about that maybe in Q&A. Joint Operations Center operations, that is how to manage the battlefield in real time as your units are conducting operations on the battlefield, and command and control. Special operations and air integration course, and intelligence and logistics support to special operations. All of this was brought into our efforts to get Ukraine ready for a potential conflict in their country. So I talked about one of the things, a couple of the components that we were most interested in. Designing or helping Ukrainians design what their strategy would be, cost imposing, attrition, warfare, etc. Looking at force protection and force generation during time of conflict. the application of maneuver and firepower in times of conflict, and the fight for legitimacy, particularly when legitimacy is being contested with you by your adversary, as we can see what's going on right now in the annexation of the oblasts here in recent days. That goes to the information operations I talked about earlier. Just one quick build for me, Emily. So this covers this educational effort covered all the domains that we would think about in conflict: air, land, maritime, cyber, and space. So this education is just not geared towards your typical infantry battalion or brigade. A lot of it is tailored specifically towards, for instance, in Poland, a territorial force that has to initially conduct a defense as their main body is retrograding for protection, or their border personnel, or their police personnel. So it's all designed to be integrated into a cohesive effort. Okay, so I'll pause there real quick, because I know that's a lot. There's a lot of scattershot in terms of what we were doing. I want you to kind of think about that. I'll just hold this slide up for a second. Maybe there's some discussion that you guys want to do in Q&A. Slide, please. The last thing I want to cover before maybe getting into a discussion with you guys is this idea of where we're going and what's the end for Russia and for Vladimir Putin. As I said earlier, you know, he's never really shied away from broadcasting what his intent and what he's looking at doing. These maps here date all the way back to 2014. This idea of Novorossiya or New Russia. And you can see what they span, which is the entire breadth of the southern Ukrainian countryside, all the way to Moldova and Transnistria. This is what he has said he would like to gain. I think this is still in his optic. Obviously, he's had setbacks on the battlefield. I think that regardless of whether or not there's negotiated settlement, at least in the near term, that this will, so long as Vladimir Putin is in power, this is the end state that he's looking to fight for. And so I think this is what we need to keep in mind when we're still engaging with Ukraine, that if there's stability in the east, it's only stable for a short period of time as there's sort of a pause and a reintroduction of the campaign that started in 2014. Okay, that's the sort of the meat and potatoes of my presentation to you guys, and what we've been doing to get Ukraine, you know, ready to go since 2014. I know it's a lot. There's a lot there. There's a lot of ideas. But let me just pause there and see if there's anything that stands out to you guys, or any questions that I can answer for you at this point.
Hi, am I Joe? Thank you so much for that presentation. I think I'll lead off and with the questions, and do what I can to sort of moderate the questions from the audience. So everybody who's participating, please drop your questions into the chat box, and then I'll do my best to get to all of the questions. And thanks again. So Joe, I mean, it would be really helpful, I think, for all of us to hear from you some inside, maybe even personal reflections on what has been maybe perhaps the most striking aspect of the conflict for many of us, you know, who aren't there in Ukraine, which is the way in which the Ukraine forces, special forces and other forces, have managed to push back so effectively one of the world's largest and most powerful militaries. So I'm curious, to what degree has this outcome so far in this level of, you know, this stage in the conflict, how has it been? How are you surprised by this? And to what degree, you know, has your work and the specific role of special forces in Ukraine, is it responsible for this, the rather extraordinary success of Ukrainian military?
So, you know, it's an interesting question. You know, when I was going into Poland a lot, the units that we were working in, for instance, in Poland, were Formosa, which is their Navy SEAL equivalent, Agat, which is their range regiment. GROM A and GROM B, which were their tier 1 or high-end CT force, one GROM A being land and GROM B being maritime focused, and an element called JWK, which centers on unconventional warfare. And I would talk to these guys pretty regularly, and I used to tell them, I'm like, look, you know, you guys, the Russians aren't 10 feet tall. You know, they have a large amount of weaknesses that we can think about exploiting if conflict comes. What informs me about this? What informs me about this is the level of difficulty that the Russians faced when they were squared off against the Georgians in 2008. You know, I'm a student of that particular conflict, and the Russians just did not do very well. There's a great quote by a Russian general at the time, something to the effect of, it's an understatement on his part. It's something to the effect of, it doesn't go unnoticed that there's a large gap between theory and practice when it comes to how well they were doing in the Georgian front. Look, in Georgia, at least in my mind, my reading, they were looking to do regime change in 2008. They just could not effect it. So going much forward, the standard by which we were looking to train Ukrainians, Georgians, Poles, Romanians, etc., was the NATO standard, a very high standard. High standard in terms of comprehensive combined arms, at the tactical level, strategic operational linkage between a campaign plan and tactical maneuver formations going forward. That NATO, that robust NATO capability that we were bringing to the Ukrainians at the time, led me at least to believe that Ukrainians had a significant advantage in terms of capability. Maybe not in terms of initial weapon systems and some other sort of tactical operational level capabilities, but at least in my mind, certainly two things: the fighting spirit, fighting for something, the desire to keep the country intact, and the large amount of effort that we were making to bring up their capabilities. In light of how difficult it was in Georgia in 2008, I felt, and I think a lot of my colleagues felt, that Ukraine always had a significant probability of doing very well against a Russian formation. The issue is would their morale against the initial push be weakened enough where they wouldn't be able to rally? And I think that we've seen that they can rally and bring to bear those capabilities that were created after 2014 with a lot of significant effort, bring to bear on the battlefield. I think that's what we're seeing in the last few months, obviously.
And how significant do you feel Ukrainian special operations are to the battlefield successes that we've seen over the last several months?
So let me just talk about what it is that NATO SOF is earmarked to do. It's a little different than what the United States can bring to bear with our special operations community. In NATO, in the NATO parlance, there's three operations that Ukrainian SOF was looking at undertaking. One, direct action, that is lethal force against a known target or a fixed site. Special reconnaissance, that is those kinds of reconnaissance that are difficult to conduct beyond the line of contact, particularly if there's clandestine or other methods to be used. And military assistance, that is, how do you gather potential capability within the population, and it doesn't have to be lethal. It doesn't have to be lethal capability. It could be reporting. It could be coming onto YouTube or taking pictures. How do you bring that capability into the fighting force to garner morale and or to counter Russia propaganda efforts? So those three efforts were focused on post 2014. If a SOF unit or if a SOF formation can do those things all by themselves, that's still not enough. Integration with conventional forces is where the Ukrainians really, I think, made a lot of headway and garnered a lot of success. Direct action, special reconnaissance in support of conventional maneuver, in support of the operational and campaign. That's where I think Ukraine has a significant premium over Russian capabilities. So Ukrainian soft operating on the battlefield, not all by themselves, doing whatever it is that they feel like it's necessary for Ukrainian soft, but Ukrainian soft operating on the battlefield and how it impacts Ukrainian conventional forces maneuver plan. That's the integration that we were looking for in Ukraine in 2014 and beyond up to now. And I think it's been paying dividends for them.
Sorry, a question here from Chandler Bracken. I'll just read it to you. I'm a Marine Corps veteran and current Arizona National Guardsman. I have 7 years of military experience beneath my belt and found your talk very insightful. My question is, what do you think is the disconnect between senior Russian military leaders and junior soldiers? From what I've seen, the Russian troops on the ground are very disorganized and uninformed as to what their mission is. For example, at the beginning of the conflict, many Russian soldiers thought the invasion of Ukraine was another training exercise. That is until the bullets started flying towards them.
So I'll say something general about the Russians. You know, this goes back to working with them as when I was assigned to the Russian Airborne Brigade in the Balkans, all up until the time I was working in Republic of Georgia with a lot of Russian formations around our little compound. Up until now, and looking at particularly in Georgia in 2008, Russians have extreme difficulty with combined arms maneuver, in my opinion. That is not just my opinion. That's the opinion of a lot of folks that I talked to about this. Combined arms maneuver, infantry armor, and particularly air integration on getting that thing right. Why? Why do they have that? Why is it difficult for them to do that? Going to the question, I don't think, in fact, I know they don't have the kind of non-commissioned officer corps that Western militaries have. They just do not have that. Junior officers are their institutional bedrock. That is to say, they're the ones, the institutional memory comes from their junior officer corps, not from non-commissioned officers. And so if you don't have a non-commissioned officer corps, that is the bedrock of discipline training and motivation, and you don't have that, even if you're able to train individual pieces of the combined arms maneuver problem, it's not going to be integrated or holistic. And certainly if you do an exercise against it, it's not going to last very long because it'll just sort of dissipate. I always tell folks that armies are sort of like sand through your fingers. You know, it requires constant training, funding, motivation, and leadership. And if you don't have those things in bulk, it just sort of sifts. And I think in your own history in the Marine Corps and National Guard, you could probably see elements of this even with our own force. If you don't have those things, sort of all your training dissipates rather quickly. I think the Russians have come up against this quite a bit. Why didn't they know what they were going to get into? I think that they were trying some operational security, which is, you know, in my mind, ridiculous. I know that Putin, for instance, in 2020, as late as 2020, there was a directive to the Russian military to remove cell phones from soldiers, which is, as you know, difficult to do. And that's to prevent operational security, that's to enhance operational security for units in the field, so they're not texting back to or calling their loved ones and basically telling everybody what's going on. I think that they were really concerned about potential posturing by Ukraine in preparation for the impending invasion. You know, when we look back on early 2022, that the U.S. administration was broadcasting pretty hard to the Ukrainian political leadership on, this is coming, get ready. You have 180,000, 200,000 Russians massing around the breadth from Belarus all the way through to Russia, and we were telling them, this is coming. And I think even as late as early February 22, President Zelensky was like, they're just exercising. They're trying to scare us. They're trying to rattle us. This is not an invasion. So I think that President Putin was trying to preclude operational leakages from happening by not informing the soldiers. But of course, this has a lot of drawbacks, as we can see. Not least of which is the soldiers wondering what the hell they're there for.
Question here from Justice Tarburton. We've seen the mobilization in Russia involving conscripts. In World War II, the Russians lost almost 30 million people. While Ukrainians may have the will to fight, the Russians seemingly are not scared to suffer. What happens if Russia tries to win the war in
Yeah,
Ukraine?
this is a great question. There's a senior special forces officer, General Roberson, who commanded U.S. SOF in Syria, and made an observation that I thought was pretty interesting, which is that he felt at the time, and this is during the time when a Wagner group, but that is a Russian private military company, Wagner Group, quasi associated with the Russian government, was doing a water crossing, aggressing against a U.S. position, and essentially the United States killed those Russians. A pretty significant event, and the blowback against that was pretty enormous in terms of the casualties the Russians had. The takeaway from General Roberson's position is the Russians cannot sustain large amounts of casualties. His opinion. The reason of which he thinks is because at that time, 2018, 2019, not a conscript army, conscript army, but fielded at that time in Syria by professionals. Soviet Union and Russia are two different animals, right? You had the Soviet Union, almost 300 million people, I think, all told, if you count up all the different provinces. The Russian Federation down to 180 million folks. Of which their population demographics increasingly is not in their favor. If you just look at their male population is just a small component. Their fighting age male population, 18 to 50. That population has seen an overall decline, not just because of COVID, but because of all the alcohol and drug abuse, et cetera. So they're in a population hurt locker right now. And I think that if they were sustaining a significant amount of casualties, which they are apparently doing, 50,000 reported killed or wounded, but those have been taken from the provinces, outlying provinces. I don't think they can sustain the kinds of casualties that they sustained in World War II when the much larger entity we called the Soviet Union at that time was fighting for their lives. And remember that in the Soviet days, they were fighting inside the Soviet Union, inside Russia, as the Germans were advancing onto Moscow. This is a completely different, mental picture as Russians are dying in Ukraine. For what reason, they have to tell themselves and give themselves a story behind that, which I think is increasingly more difficult to do. Why are we having Russian soldiers or Russian young people dying in the battlefields of Ukraine? What is the purpose here? I don't think that's been articulated to the Russian people as I don't think it's a very cogent argument that the Russian leadership is having these days. Anyway, that's a long way around the barn to say I don't believe that the Russian demographics can support large numbers of Russian casualties at this time.
Question from AJ Gurmak. What can the military do to further call into question Putin's leadership by the Russian military and government? I think he may mean by the Russian military. What can the Russian military do to further call into question Putin's leadership? I think that's the focus.
So let me. So I think the question is there? Daniel, read that to me one more time.
Yeah, sure. Let me just read it to you. You answer the way it makes most sense. What can the military do to further call into question Putin's leadership by the Russian military and government? I guess U.S. and Ukrainian military or Western powers.
Oh, okay. Well, look. I mean, it's actually pretty fun. I shouldn't say pretty fun. It's tragic, but there's some interesting things here. The training that had been occurring since 2014, you actually see it happening in the news. It's actually quite remarkable, as you can imagine. The things that we were advocating and talking to them about, they're doing, the Ukrainians. One of which is the social media space. We used to talk to them quite a bit about, listen, social media is going to be where you're going to be fighting via Telegram, via Twitter, via Facebook, via YouTube, which right now I don't believe YouTube is as clamped down as some of the social media platforms in Russia. So what are the Ukrainians doing? They're taking advantage of this, and they are broadcasting all over the place in terms of what's going on in Russia. Sometimes they get a little bit of blowback. Initially, when the Ukrainians were taking Russian captives, you would see them, put them on the TV screen. Why are you here? There was some desire on their allied part not to sort of parade the Russian captives. However, They are broadcasting Russian cell phone intercepts. They are showing what's going on in the battlefield. If you're tracking any of the Ukraine Telegram channels, you're seeing what's going on in places like Liman, in Kherson, in the north part of the country around Kharkiv, and you're seeing this continuing advance. I know the Russians are seeing that as well. And so, how does Ukraine and how do we, the West, undermine Russian the idea of Russian support, the Russian machine and their capabilities is by just broadcasting what's happening on the battlefield back to Russia, which they are seeing. I think one of the reasons that you're seeing the mass exodus after the mobilization by Putin of young Russians is because they know what's happening. Younger Russians, they know what's happening on the battlefield because they follow these channels, and they're seeing the devastation that's occurring to the Russian units that are going on right now. And again, if the Russians see this, it has an eroding effect on the overall popular will and the morale of the Russian fighting force. It has to.
Question from Galen Hanlon. What logistical preparations or training do you believe had the most significant impact on Ukraine's tactical and operational success? If Russian expansion is unlikely to subside so long as Putin remains, what logistical principles should we carry forward to our other partners along the Russian frontier? So two questions in a sense.
Well, let me just say that the logistical groundwork laid since 2014 in the east part of the NATO alliance, that is the Baltic region, Poland, Romania, and Romania has access to the Black Sea in the port of Constanta, and in Georgia, by the way, with the port of Poti there. That logistical footprint is enormous. You can imagine the kind of effort if we had not laid that groundwork since 14 to push the material that we're talking about into Ukraine in just terms of ammunition. Not even if you discount the larger pieces of equipment, the HIMARS and but if you're just talking about javelin ammunition, javelin launchers, and ammunition for Ukrainians, that would be much more difficult to do had we not laid all this additional groundwork in. I think the second, so there's a lot of effort on the NATO/USSOCOM side to get preparation, to put in place a lot of mechanisms to facilitate material flow into Ukraine in case war comes. That's number one. I think the second part of the question, Daniel, if you could read that for me again.
Yeah, sure. What logistical preparations and training do you believe had the most significant impact on Ukraine's tactical and operational success?
Yeah. Well, look, you guys may know this, that an army on the move is much more difficult to sustain than an army in a defensive position. As the initial push by the Russians back in early part of 22. That harnessing of equipment, and the Russians are feeling this too with HIMARS interdicting the logistics node. The training that occurred since 14 and continues to, frankly, to this day on the logistical front allows the Ukrainians to continue to march eastward and not outrun their logistical tail. And as we introduce more and more equipment, the more difficult this becomes. One of the questions by the Ukrainians that keeps rearing its head is the introduction of Western main battle tanks, particularly the M1 or the M1 Abrams tank. And a lot of the reasons maybe you don't see an initial push by more, let's say, larger pieces of equipment like the M1 Abrams tank, is that would be a logistical nightmare. It's a logistical nightmare for the United States to operate the M1 Abrams. It'll be much more difficult and potentially bog down the effort if we were to look at introducing the M1s, a 70-ton chassis of which we're not even sure whether the eastern approaches in Ukraine can support, not least of which the bridges and the maintenance package and the kind of low boys that require it to move, and the wreckers that would need to be pushed forward in terms of battlefield recovery if an M1 is lost. Looking at other platforms that don't provide the logistical pressure on Ukrainians, but allows them the same ballpark in terms of capability is what we're looking at now, which is why I think the German main battle tank is probably more appropriate. So just another logistics issue that I think is being balanced out these days.
Here's a question from David Randolph. There has been little publicity about resistance activity in Russian-controlled areas such as Kherson. What is your view of the success of Ukrainian special forces operations in mobilizing the population against Russian forces?
That's a great question. It's one of the questions I asked my Ukrainian soft counterparts that, and I think here's the thing. Here's the answer I typically get, and no, though I think things are happening there along that front. That is, I think that there is a desire to involve populations to resist in the occupied areas. There's a problem though with this, at least initially, before the 22 hostilities, was the sort of the balance of ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians in those occupied, let's say occupied areas, with sort of, let's say, favored ethnic Russians. Reprisals against potential ethnic Ukrainians collaborating with I use the term collaborating, but not in terms of collaborating with Russians, but the ethnic Russians' view of collaboration with Ukraine that time, and the reprisals on those folks I think we're going to find out was pretty brutal. So I think, why aren't we seeing more resistance from the population in occupied portions of Ukrainian territory by the Russians? I think it's because the reprisals are so detrimental to that effort. I think that there needs to be more support provided first to remove a little bit of the pressure by Russian internal security services before you can get sort of a larger popular movement in those occupied regions. And I think what backs sort of the idea that backs me up on that is sort of the atrocities that we've been seeing in places where the Russians are departing, the mass graves, the deporting of a large number of Ukrainian children back to Russia, etc. I think these are the kinds of things that precluded a large civil population from resisting Russians in the occupied areas for a long period of time, unfortunately.
One thing we've heard a lot about, but maybe not with adequate granularity and detail, is the way in which Western intelligence services have provided assistance to Ukrainian forces at various levels. I'm wondering, to what degree do you think that back and forth, intelligence coming from the West and possibly intelligence sharing and intelligence analysis, how significant is this for the Ukrainians' battlefield successes since February?
I think it's critical. I think the intelligence sharing in 2002 with allies partners was nowhere near as capable as intelligence sharing with allies and partners in 2022. That is, from the United States as a single entity pushing intelligence out. We have learned a lot of good lessons in terms of our ability to share intel. What kind of intel? What intel do we want to keep to ourselves in terms of sources and methods and means? And what can we give to people that are allied to us, are partnered with us, that help them in their fight and actually obviously benefit us as well as their benefactors?
Without revealing anything like overly operational, can you give some sort of general example of something surprising along those lines that would be illustrative for the conflict?
Well, I mean, I'll just say on open source, you saw the reporting that the United States is providing targeted data for Russian leadership. I don't doubt that for a second. So I think even just targeting data, I think that there's also been intelligence sharing on the strength and locations of Russian vehicle platforms, main battle tanks, etc. Using many different, aerial platforms that we have available to us, on sharing that information to help the Ukrainians both target lines in the Russian formations that may be weaker than other places. So I think there's a lot of that. I think also in terms of intelligence sharing, just in terms of satellite imagery and geography, which is super important in real-time conflict when you're moving formations across the area. Those kinds of things are invaluable as well. And by the way, the Ukrainians are no slouches in this regard either. I mean, it's a sophisticated country. It's a lot of smart and talented folks. All they need is additional support from Western allies, and I think they're up and running pretty self by themselves.
A question here from Justice Tarbert. Is there the potential for an uprising or mass protest in Russia given Ukrainian and Western weaponized narratives? Could we help Ukraine win this war using gray zone conflicts to demoralize or divide Russia in order to stop the fighting?
I think that's what I was alluding to when I was talking about the social media space and the information environment. It's rather startling to me just how bad the Russian media space outside of Russia is, and I think it's actually internal to them as well. I do sort of watch for indicators on what is happening in terms of the sanctions. Who do the Russian people blame for the sanctions? Who do the people blame for the mobilization? What do they think of the Ukraine? What do they think of Ukrainian war? What do they think of what do the Russians think of the mobilization? These little data points help you kind of get what it is, the potential for civil resistance is in Russia. I mean, you saw a little bit of it in terms of the immediacy of the immediately after the announcement for mobilization. You saw some significant numbers for Russia protests going on in the major cities in St. Petersburg and Moscow. One of the commenters that I do listen to is a Russian exile. Was saying that he thought that the mobilization has to fail before the Russian people really do turn against the regime. That is to say, okay, you're going to take our children away from us, our sons, and send them to the front. That better work is essentially what his contention is. And if it doesn't work, which we don't think it will, then that's when sort of there is no way forward at that point. You've expended the round that you had available to you, which is mobilizing your available manpower. And if that bears no fruit on the battlefield, which we don't think it will, then that's where the roosters come home, as they say. And I think that spells that maybe where the population does see that this is not going well, and for no reason.
Given that the issue of gray zone conflict has been brought up, I'm curious, before this February, many folks thought that Russian strategy would be sort of the epitome of sophisticated gray zone conflict, including clever and well-managed cyber attacks. So what explains the fact that we see not a lack of cyber attacks, but a lack of the efficacy of those attacks in the Ukraine space? What explains that, and does that have anything to do with the sort of work you were doing there?
Yeah, I mean, it's another great question, and I think the answer to it is something to the effect that the Russians felt that their gray zone activities were sufficient enough to soften the resolve of the Ukraine were they to introduce major combat forces. That's the analysis that I think is most salient with me. That is to say, between 2014 and 2022, there's been enough doubt whether to. I don't believe that this happened, but this is, I think, the Russians came to believe this, that there was enough eroding of resolve for Ukraine, particularly Zelensky, that were the Russians introduced major combat operations in Ukraine, that would quickly fall. That turns out to be exactly not what happened, but I think that's what the Russians came to believe. Look, Crimea in 2014 was predominantly a ethnically Russian haven. It was predominantly populated by ethnic Russians because of the large number of military bases that are in Crimea. and the proximity to Russia. And even in that time, I think even Crimea wasn't particularly, welcome that the Russians annexed that. And I don't exactly know why the Russians. I have a theory on why the Russians chose 2022 to launch the invasion. Why they chose major combat operations, that is major overt military power, because it wasn't going to. The gray zone operations weren't going to achieve decisiveness in the time frame that Vladimir Putin wanted. So he had to resort to major combat operations, and I think he felt that the gray zone efforts, the cyber, et cetera, which we've been. By the way, it's interesting that how cyber has not come to the fore in terms of providing Russia with a lot of opportunities in this latest effort since early 22. Predominantly, I think because the West have seen, saw what happened in 2008, saw what happened in 2014, and prepared the Ukrainians. So I don't think those options were available to Vladimir Putin for the decisiveness in removing the Kiev regime in the time frame that Vladimir Putin wanted. I think that's why he chose.
So we only have a few minutes left, but you've worked in special operations throughout the world in many different locales. I'm just curious, personally, how has your work in Ukraine and your being involved in watching what's happened this year in particular, how has that affected you emotionally, professionally? And what reflections do you have as someone who's spent decades working in this area in a variety of different contexts with a lot of different outcomes?
Yeah, I was in Mongolia recently, and in Chad. So I have the opportunity to travel quite extensively. I was in Mongolia in December and Chad a couple of months ago. And what I find is, for instance, in Mongolia, the Russians have a pretty strong relationship with the Mongolian military. The Russians do all the company level training for the Mongolian military. So their captains and below get training in Russia. They speak fluent Russian. And then the Mongolians reach out to the West for the sort of more sophisticated, military training. And sort of the Mongolians understand their geography, understand who their neighbors are, China and Russia, and yet they're still reaching out to the West for more sophisticated training, although trying to keep the Russians at least a little bit, in their pen. Chad, real quick, Wagner Group in Sudan. Russians in the same hotel that I was staying in N'Djamena can hear their what they're talking about, and they were Wagner guys. So I think what it's shown me is that the world is a competitive space right now, and we're being the West, and particularly the United States, are being contested in a lot of different areas, and it's pretty interesting in places where we have to be attuned to what's happening in a lot of these remote areas where we wouldn't typically be in the forefront of our mind. Places like Chad, South Sudan, Central Africa, and the Sahel region. I find that what's going on in Ukraine, what's happening in Ukraine right now, I do talk to my counterparts in other places of the world right now, and just to get a sense of kind of what they're seeing with regards to Russian involvement in their area. That's just a Russian piece.
So in our final minute or so, any short, takeaways that those of us who have not been working with special operations forces in Ukraine and wouldn't see, what's a big takeaway from your work there and from what's going on? What's the big lesson that we can all mull over?
The big lesson for me, I think for a lot of folks looking at this, is just how capable we in partnership with our Ukrainian brothers and sisters have made them. Their desire to learn, their desire to fight for their country, their desire to be involved, and our desire to help them gain the advantages that are available to them. Maybe not in large numbers, certainly not in a nuclear space, but available to them and what we can give them. That has proven fairly remarkable and remarkably effective That's what I have come away with this. You know, in the early days of 22, you know, people were like, oh, you know, the Ukrainians are going to get boot stomped, and you know, the Russians are just a mighty fighting force. And I was always thinking, you know, I don't think that's true, guys. You know, it does look dark right now, but you know, we've put a lot of effort into Ukraine, and Ukraine is they're not going to fall. They're not going to. They're moving back to preserve the force is exactly what we talked to them about. Trade a little bit of space for preservation of the force, and then move forward when you have the opportunity and when you've got the force generation and capability in place and all the other things that you need. This is what we've been talking to them about since 2014. One other thing, one last thing. As I was watching the current counteroffensive take place and the large amount of talk that the main effort was going to be in the South, I had been thinking to myself, you know, is that what's going to happen, or are they going to push north? And as soon as those words were coming out of my mouth, Ukraine was punching north. Great campaign design, in my opinion. Great use of the operational space, the operational environment, the information space, military deception, social media, just in terms of troop movement, and then broadcasting where one effort is going to be, and then you punch in the north. These are the kinds of things that we have been talking about since 2014 with our counterparts. Operational planning, soft operations, soft integration with conventional forces, morale, leadership, and determination and maneuver. And it seems to me, as I'm watching the battle space, that these things that are coming to fruition, and I just see they're getting stronger in relation to Russia. And I don't know Russia is getting any better, you know, at this. They're just continually get punched in the face at every turn. And the only thing they can do at this point is throw numbers against it, and that's not going to work. So, yeah, I think that this effort has been this effort that we undertook since 2014, that we all knew could pay dividends, and hopefully we're all hoping it wouldn't, because we didn't want to see war in beautiful Ukraine. But if war did come, we felt fairly confident the Ukrainians could take the fight to the Russians, and we always advocated that. We always vocalized that to our Russian counterparts, particularly the soft guys. And I think this is what we've been seeing. So this is what sort of, you know, makes me pretty happy about what we've been doing.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. It's really a pleasure and honor to have you here, and great to hear the perspective that you have, which is really quite a unique one for most of us. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. We will have our second event of the Fall Speaker Series next week, October 13th. Stefan Kramer, who's the president of the State Domestic Intelligence Service in Thuringia, German state, he's primarily responsible for intelligence gathering and state action against right-wing groups, of which there are quite a few in Germany. Very interesting speaker. His talk is entitled Confronting Rising Anti-Semitism and Right-Wing Hate Groups in Germany. So please join us. That will be from 9 to 10 in the morning to deal with the time zone difference in Germany. Thank you so much for your time this evening, and we wish you all a good night.